and welcome to Luminaria. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Robert Con Davis-Undiano, Professor of English at the University of Oklahoma and Executive Director of World Literature Today. Dr. Davis-Undiano specializes in American Studies, Chicano Studies, Cultural Studies, Literary and Cultural Theory, and has written a number of books and articles, but I actually ran into him through my work, where I was hosting a panel and he was one of the speakers. And after the panel was over, we got into a really interesting conversation about identity. And it really touched on a lot of my own personal struggles with identity and some of the same, debate, struggles back and forth that I see among the New Mexico genealogy community. So I was really anxious to get him on the podcast, and we're lucky enough to talk to him today. I also realized that I already had a copy of one of his books, Mestizo's Come Home, which explores a lot of these issues and presents a lot of really interesting history and arguments for why this is such a struggle for so many people in this community. So hope you enjoy this conversation. Can you start us out a little bit with your own background in terms of your own identity and how that led to your interest in Chicano studies and your own academic career?
Yeah. My dad was from Mexico, from Torreon, Mexico, big industrial city in the north, about 500,000 people. And my mom was from Oklahoma. And I think my mom didn't quite realize that she had married a Mexican and just thought he was a good-looking guy, and that was it. And she was determined that I would not identify with him. She didn't want me to learn Spanish. She really was not interested in my connecting with that part of the family. And so I grew up barely knowing any of my Mexican relatives, which was very disturbing to me. And I work in Spanish now, and people speak Spanish to me all the time, but I don't have that kind of native understanding that I would have had if I had spoken Spanish all my life. And so a few years ago, before 2017, I decided to write a book that would be kind of everything you wanted to know about the Mexican-American community, but were afraid to ask, kind of a interesting, somewhat, kind of neutral, informational book. And as I got into it, I realized a couple of things. One, that it was cultural recovery for me because I was studying as a scholar and an academic and a thinker, all kinds of angles into Mexican and Latino culture that I needed to recover for myself because I hadn't known all of this growing up. And then the other thing that I discovered was, especially after Barack Obama was elected the second time to the presidency, was that America wasn't very curious about Latinos and Mexican Americans, and it had some terrible misconceptions about Mexican Americans, Mexicans just being invaders across the border, and here was this pristine culture and country, and they were kind of upsetting the apple cart. And there were some really disturbing books coming out around that time. One by Samuel Huntington and several other people that basically were trying to sound an alarm about Mexican Americans even being in the United States. And then I saw a rash of new violence and discriminatory laws, the kind of thing I teach at the University of Oklahoma, Mexican American culture and studies, basically has been outlawed. It's not legal to teach that at the University of Oklahoma anymore. The book that I was writing came out. It's called Mestizo's Come Home, 2017. Making and Claiming Mexican American Identity would be an illegal book at the University of Oklahoma because it talks too much about one strain of the culture. And so this project that I intended to be informational, like a book version of like a Wikipedia article, took on a different character. I realized there was a sort of urgency to write this book. And there were so many things that had happened in the U.S. going back decades and centuries that were low-hanging fruit as far as understanding Latino culture in the U.S. And there were, in a way, some hidden information, things about the Latino community and their presence in the U.S. that the white community just was not comfortable with, wasn't going to talk about. So large parts of Mexican American history were blotted out, and there's so many stories that needed to be retold, needed to be pushed forward. So, so that's the urgency that grew up around the book, and it became Mestizo's Come Home, a kind of invitation to the Mexican American and Mestizo community, Latino community, to finish the job of claiming this culture as their own, and denying that they were interlopers, invaders from across the board. That really wasn't the case. Mexican Americans have been part of this country really basically from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And the United States has a much more diverse inauguration as a culture, as a country, than a lot of white people are comfortable with. So that's basically this setting the stage for the book that I wrote.
So why, this is something why I really wanted to have this conversation, because I see it in my own life, my own struggles with identity and where I fit and how much I can claim of that identity or of a specific culture. And then I also see within the community, I mostly genealogy, but also history communities in New Mexico, that northern New Mexico, southern Colorado culture. There seems like every couple of weeks, every couple of months, there's some new debate that you see in the comments. People are within this very specific culture are still unsure what to call themselves, or they all identify differently, and they all have very specific reasons for why they identify that way. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about why I think the book kind of goes into why there is a little bit of an inherent struggle in that, or why people can't quite, there's this community over here, there's this one over here. Do I belong? Which one do I belong in? Do I belong in all of them or none of them? Or, and so I thought maybe it'd be good to start out with just sort of a couple of the names, identifiers that people use. There's Hispanic, there's Mexican American, there's Chicano, Latino, and then specific to New Mexico, a lot of people will say they're Hispano, Manito, Nuevo Mexicano. There are all these sort of different terms. So can you break up at the beginning of the book, you kind of break down some of those?
Yeah, well, the simplest term, and in some ways the place to start, is just Mexican American. And it just means somebody that probably had relatives in Mexico, but they were maybe born in the U.S., or my father came to the U.S. from Mexico when he was around 12. And so their culture of identification is here, but that includes the richness that has to do with also coming from Mexico. During the Nixon administration, the federal government coined the term Hispanic, which was really not a natural term for the community at all.
That was for the census?
For the census. And particularly Mexican American people pushed back on that. They weren't comfortable with it, and they started using the term Latino, their own coinage. They wanted to basically name themselves and not be named by the federal government that they didn't feel very close to anyway. And then and the Mexican American community has sort of gone back and forth with those two terms. I have a lot of Mexican American friends who do use the term Hispanic, and they're not bothered by it anymore and don't remember anything about the Nixon administration or never knew it or whatever. And sometimes they use that term, and sometimes Latino. A term that has more sort of coloring and texture to it is the term Chicano. Chicano. And that term really arose out of the Chicano Renaissance in the late 60s and 70s and 80s, in some ways even up to the present, where the Mexican American community, particularly in the Southwest, but also all over the U.S., mobilized itself to be more politically aware, to act more on behalf of the community, their community, to be proactive, politically sophisticated, aware, culturally doing the sort of cultural recovery. What I've done for myself, they were doing as a community back then. So a Chicano is a Mexican American. It's not any other designation. It would never be used as for a Cuban American or something like that. It's a Mexican American who is working on behalf to develop the community. And so there's political awareness, cultural activism, and so on. And I think that term is probably a little bit dated now. I'm older, and so I'm very comfortable saying I'm a Chicano. I am a Chicano, a Mexican American with that political and cultural awareness. But I think there are young Mexican Americans in California that say, no, I'm not a Chicano. That's for you. That's for you guys to use. I'm a Mexican American, and we've got new terms, and we're coining things to call ourselves all the time. So, these are interesting terms. There's not universal acceptance of any of them. And over the years, it's been surprising that in New Mexico, I can remember several cases where families went to court. These are Mexican American families going to court to bar teachers from using the term Chicano in the classroom. They didn't want it. They thought that it was alien to them. There are people in northern New Mexico, and a OU professor has studied this and wrote a book called Hispano Homeland, who basically say, we are Spanish. We are pure Spanish. We came here and we've remained Spanish. We haven't mixed. We're not Chicanos. And they maintain that. And that's not a proposition that you can defend very well. DNA analysis would destroy it pretty quickly, but it's important to them. And my own mother, who was she was a Southern girl from Oklahoma and Arkansas, was in effect in pain over my identification with my father. She didn't want that. She'd say, look, the Undianos, your family, you're from Spain. And there's actually a town in northern Spain called Undiano that my family came from. So your family is Spanish. And of course, my reaction was, Mom, the people who came over from Spain and had children with indigenous people here, there's a name for them. They're Mexicans. And I've come out of that tradition. And, she couldn't argue with that, but she didn't accept it either. And so, that's where a lot of people who are not interested, or most of them, it's not a matter of not being interested in history. I think they're fearful of history. They don't want to learn what their past holds. And as I was saying to you just a couple of moments before we started the conversation, people that know a lot about their past, and the horse traders and horse dealers, as well as the doctors and lawyers and so on, are generally a lot more accepting about the details with less judgment of other people's past, and very often people that just have a kind of sense of entitlement that they're white and they don't really care much about the details. Very often are not very accepting of differences in other people, and I've seen that a lot.
So you were disconnected from your father and his side of the family for most of your...
Yeah, and I took it on myself to reconnect with my Mexican relatives. I did that, and to some degree, it was successful. I discovered that some of those Mexican relatives, I have light skin. A lot of my relatives have dark skin. Who knows why? Just the mystery of genetics. And I have a cousin, for example. She has much darker skin than I do, and she was a stewardess for Southwest Airlines. And kind of like my mother, was offended in my interest in my background and being Mexican American and the culture, and back then listening to Selena, people like that, and basically had spent her life trying to lighten her skin and fit in. These are painful situations where somebody is just so much at war with who they are and what their past is and was about. And so that attempt to sort of reconnect with my past through the Mexican American side was not successful a lot of the time, because we were not on the same page. And they weren't quite sure where I wanted to go with this, because they had spent their lives trying to be assimilated and fit in and not be singled out as somebody that didn't belong. And here I was trying to, get them to step outside of that and embrace something that seemed foreign to them and frankly a little bit dangerous. Arizona where a lot of my relatives, most of them were in Arizona, it can be a very dangerous place. The gun carry laws have been liberal for a long time. And watching the news at night there, the 10 o'clock news is bracing. It's really hard. There's so much gun violence happening all the time, and there's such a conservative hold on that state that I can see why my relatives in the past, when they arrived in Arizona from Mexico, they made their way to Phoenix. It was a very dangerous time to be a Latino, particularly a Mexican American. And they didn't want to emphasize that, and they didn't want to embrace the culture and create more trouble when they already felt somewhat alienated from the mainstream culture.
Yeah, and for example, I want to do a whole episode about why, pretty much across the board, my generation, which my parents were pretty older when I was born, so my generation is actually more like 30 years older than I actually am, but our generation across the board pretty much doesn't speak Spanish. And exploring the reasons why has been really interesting. It's very similar. My dad, for example, that generation was punished for speaking Spanish, experienced so much discrimination growing up, being identified that way, that it was very much until he actually became involved in the sort of against his will, involved in the Chicano power movement in Denver as an educator, as a Hispanic educator in the Denver area. Then he started to reclaim some of that, but I can still sense as I'm exploring all of this stuff that he's a little like I think there's that dissonance as well that you've described in your own family.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable feeling. The University of Oklahoma, being a professor here, opened some things up because with a mother from Oklahoma and a southern woman, and then a dad from Mexico, my background mirrors the backgrounds of a lot of my students, and I can basically say I can understand both sides because I reclaim the Mexican side and know a lot more about it than my students do, even though they grew up with it. But I also know many of them have a mother like the mother I have, and so I think that's actually my background, and letting my students understand my background, being very honest about it, has made me closer to them in general, because they have to negotiate that terrain between a parent who's probably from Oklahoma or Arkansas and a parent from Mexico, and they know what the difficulties are. And they appreciate being able to identify with me in that way.
Yeah, because my mother's from a white Midwestern farm family, and it always, when I think about it, boggles my mind that the two of them got together, to be honest. But still married, they're still together after almost 60 years this year. And I grew up more with her side of the family, and it was always square peg round hole situation. I just none of it ever fit. I never fit into any of it. The culture, the communication, it just has never felt like me. And then as an adult, I took it on myself to learn more about my dad's side of the family, reconnect with some of them, and then discovering some of the cultural aspects and this whole history that I knew nothing about, literally nothing about, until probably I was around 30. And that opened up this whole new world that felt so much more resonant. It just all seemed so much more aligned with who I was, and just felt so much more at home with that. And I can't help wondering, feeling the loss of that. What person would I be if I had been raised in that culture that felt so much more aligned with my values, who I am. And I know in the book you talk about sort of the differences, our ancestors, even up to like our grandparents or parents, there was acculturation, but also some assimilation had to occur as a necessity for survival. But then you had this like extreme difference in culture. So regarding, I think you said, sex, death, the body.
Mm-hmm.
I would add communication, family, from the mainstream sort of Anglo-Protestant mainstream American culture, such cultural differences there and needing to sort of fit into that more dominant culture. And just wondering, I understand why that had to happen or why that did happen, but just feeling that it was to my detriment now, the loss of that.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think you and I are sketching out a situation, kind of a basket of difficulties that lots of people like us have experienced. What has really been very difficult for the United States, I think, is the realization as we got, closer to the 21st century that there was a demographic shift, a huge one taking place. And, the prediction now is that by 2050, but actually probably before, this is going to be a majority Latino country. And I think the white mainstream of America never dreamed of that anything of that sort could ever happen. And then suddenly they were staring it in the face, that the country that they had identified with, they had seen it as a white place and a kind of Western European culture that if there was going to be some identification with Europe, it would be with the UK, white people, and so on and so forth. It was very, very threatening to discover that this was going to be a Latino country, and the reins of power would shift with who the population was. And I can remember when I was writing Mestizo's Come Home and thinking about it about a decade before it came out. I would listen to predictions of these demographic shifts and how this was going to be a Latino country, et cetera, and that the United States was finally going to fulfill the promise of a multicultural democracy. What had always been the goal, but we'd never gotten very close to it. Well, finally, it was going to happen because there was going to be this shift in the population. And I remember kind of scratching my head and saying this to friends. I just can't see white culture in America, mainstream culture, just going with this. Something's going to happen. They're going to be shocked. They're going to be traumatized. They're going to fight back. They could really get ugly. And friends would say, "Oh, yeah, maybe. Hope not. Hope it never happens." And it was one of those things where you can just kind of feel the earthquake is coming. And then I think the election of Barack Obama was so fundamentally shocking to mainstream white America. And then along with that, the notion that this would not be predominantly a white culture anymore. It was going to be a brown culture, a Latino culture. That was just too much for lots of people. And before I finished the book, I started seeing that earthquake that I knew was coming, but I was hoping to be wrong. And it's still happening now, And I think a lot of us who, have cultural, ethnic, racial connections to other places, but love the United States, have been really shocked in the years since then. I never thought that America would be as intolerant as it has turned out to be. I knew there was racism, but I imagined, looking at it as like a very narrow strip of misbehavior in the culture that would probably in time fade and disappear altogether. And it turns out that it wasn't a narrow strip. It was a lot of the culture feels that way. And a lot of the culture is open to conspiracy theories if it makes them feel better and kind of confirms their sense of white superiority. And they're going to be very responsive to somebody that will help them confirm that sense of a kind of entitlement and you're special and we can make America great again, which is a kind of dog whistle for make America white again and push against this demographic shift. And for a while, I thought that the pushback that finally came and the traumatized white people who really were scared to death that their country was being stolen out from under them, I thought, well, optimistically, this is like watching the water disappear down a drain. As the water disappears, it goes faster and then it disappears altogether down the drain. And I thought this is the last gasp of of white entitled culture in America, having trouble accepting what's going to happen, but basically they will at some point and they'll go along. I was wrong. It's been much more of a sustained pushback, a kind of rolling back values that really were there with the founders' dreams of a multicultural democracy. They couldn't enact it very well themselves, and they were racist and they were misogynist and so on. But that dream was real, and it's a wonderful goal. I never dreamed that America would walk back progress made through the civil rights movement and the Chicano Renaissance and so on, would walk back some of those achievements and not want them at all. And honestly, seeing the violence and the kind of thing that Barack Obama had to put up with, where people would gladly killed him, I think, if they could have. They were so offended there was a black man in the White House. And what happened on the 6th of January with the insurrection, et cetera, that, that was very much a racially loaded insurrection. America is a little scarier place than I ever realized. Maybe I love it just a little bit less than I imagined, because I never believed that those bad currents really could ever be there in the culture as they've turned out to be.
Well, a quote from the book talks about how our forgotten past has left mestizos with souls that need to be reunited, referring to this forgotten past of a history that you outline in the book about the roots of the casta system,
racial categories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so, can you talk a little bit about? I mean, I've seen a few presentations about this, and I've seen. It seems like I just thought that maybe only one or two examples, or that those are the only ones I'd seen. So I thought it was kind of a one-time, two-time deal. In the book, you say that actually there were hundreds of there's 100 existing actually now, so possibly more, that this was a regular practice of doing these paintings that illustrated categorizing by race, by color.
Let me just set this up with just a little more history. When the Spanish came to the New World in great numbers in the 16th century, we now know, this really isn't in doubt anymore, that there were in the Americas, about 25 million indigenous people, pretty large group. And the Spanish came in very much as conquistadores. They felt entitled to claim this land, and they were interested in commodity crops that could be sold in Europe, and they got into sugar. And that sugar is a very interesting thing. It's a high maintenance crop. It's very difficult to bring it to market. It's very labor intensive. So they enslaved in a massive way indigenous people to work the fields and do all this work for them. And the whole thing about sugar is really interesting. Sugar wasn't part of the diet. The everyday diet in Europe until the 19th century. It really started taking hold in the middle 19th century. We haven't always had sweets around the way that we think of it as now. So this was much earlier, and it was becoming a commodity crop, and the Spanish were trying to create a market for it and so on. But just to sort of cut to the chase here for a second, just 60 years later, after arriving in the New World, the number of indigenous people had diminished from 25 million to fewer than 1 million. The facts of this are not in doubt. It happened. I think this is a kind of information that people don't want to discuss. They don't want it to be part of our world, but it is part of our world, and it's terrifying to people to have to reckon with that. And what the Spanish discovered when they started enslaving native people and literally working them to death in fields, and of course they brought over diseases that native people had no immunities to, and there was lots of bad treatment. they did not intend to set in motion the creation of new cultural and racial identities, but they did. I mean, it was sort of an unintended consequence of the Spaniards marrying into indigenous families, and the Spanish didn't just enslave um, indigenous people, but they brought over Chinese people, and then eventually they had killed so many indigenous people by working them to death. In the Caribbean, they killed everyone. There were no indigenous people left once the Spanish really had colonized the Caribbean. And this was not acceptable at that time. I mean, the Spanish weren't evil people that thought this was a good idea. In fact, the crown, the government in Spain, brought back several Spanish conquistadors to try them for crimes against humanity in Spain. They were so upset, and at one point, the word went out: keep your hands off the indigenous people. Stop. Don't do this anymore. You've killed whole populations in the Caribbean, and look at what you've done in Mexico. And so they had that, and then there weren't any people left in the Caribbean. They had killed everyone. And so that's when they started bringing black people in. And, this is way before the United States, before, racial problems here. And so the complexity of racial identities that was an unintended consequence of what they were doing surprised and alarmed the Spanish, because these slaves they thought of as their chattel, their property, and they were interested in keeping control of their possessions. So they color coded the people that they worked with, or that they felt they owned, and indigenous people became red people. It was just a convenient color coding. Africans became black people. The Chinese became yellow people, and so on. And they created this whole superstructure of racial identities. It was really just what they observed, and they set in motion, not intending to do all this. They were trying to make money, and they were trying to find gold, and they were trying to spread Catholicism, not create new communities. So this was alarming to them. And we know now that they created, in an attempt to control what they had set in motion, what's called el sistema de casta, the caste system. And there were so many different cultural identities that they were noticing that had been produced by all this intermarriage. And we don't have any written documents from the late 17th and early 18th century when this casta system really got going, where they were putting these labels on people. But we know that they were doing it, and we know what the labels were, because they created these paintings. They commissioned paintings by some very talented people and some not so talented people, and the standard practice was to have painters do 16 different cultural, ethnic, I won't say cultural, ethnic identities, and they would create a set of 16, 4 in a row with 4 different rows, and it was kind of like a storyboarding. So if you started in the upper left corner, you would see the beginning of their racial world, with a Spaniard, a white Spaniard, marrying an indigenous person. And the format of the paintings was to see the parents in the background generally, and then the product of what they created, their child, in the foreground, usually just one child. There are variations on all of this, but that was the standard. And then as you moved in the top row from left to right, you saw greater ethnic mixing. And so a Mestizo, who was the product of a Spaniard and an indigenous person, could then marry another Mestizo, or marry an indigenous person, or whatever. And they thought of all these different options and different possibilities. And as you move from the top row, the racial mixing got greater and more complex, and Spanish made up the racial categories, to identify all these different possibilities: mestizo, pardo, castizo, mulatto, etc. So that whole vocabulary that identifies race came from the Spanish just attempt to control what they had set in motion. And when an interesting part of the set of four rows, four identities in each row, was that they were trying to encourage people to stay close to the Spanish origins. They really wanted more white people. They didn't want to see a lot of cultural mixing, and so they created the possibility of what they call blood mending. So if your family had screwed up by marrying too many indigenous people and maybe some Chinese and other races that have been brought in, and you were starting to be lower down on the social scale, you could fix it over a couple of generations by remarrying back into prime Spanish stock and re-whiten your line. And you could do this with one exception, and that exception was if your family had married into an African into African culture. There were African relatives that could not be fixed. They called that blood pollution. So there was some pretty extreme racism, and and then once they got into the third row and the fourth row, they were so unhappy with this really complex racial mixing that in Spanish they just call them a step backward or you screwed up or whatever. That was the racial name, and the people that were in those categories were just hanging on for dear life. They were not accepted in the culture. The Spanish thought they were too far away from being white, particularly if they'd intermarried with blacks from Africa. And life was ugly for the people in the third and the fourth row.
Because there were real consequences. I think you gave a couple of examples in the book. I mean, they were not just disenfranchised, but couldn't
own
pursue
property,
different.
and couldn't do certain jobs. And the other thing that you can see in these paintings is that they weren't just neutral. This person marries that person, and here's the mixture. There were judgments implied in these paintings. So very often, if there was, say, a castizo man marrying a black woman, very often she would be depicted sort of out of control, and misbehaving. There's one famous casta painting where the black mother is trying to hit the Spanish father over the head with a skillet and really brain him, and the child was trying to keep them apart and, hey, don't, pushing against the black mother. So the person of color, and the intensity of this increased as time went on. The person of color was almost always misbehaving, unresponsive, not a good parent. Sometimes the indigenous person or the black person is just looking straight ahead and not really noticing the family that they're with, and the Spanish father is comforting a daughter that's crying and so on. So the Spanish attributed all these wonderful traits to themselves, that they were compassionate, smart, doing professional jobs, and the people of color were the obverse of everything the Spanish were. They lacked compassion, lacked skill, they weren't smart, and so on and so forth. So this is very racially loaded. And again, we only know this system exists because we've got the paintings, and you said this earlier. There are about 100 sets of these paintings, and the ethnic identity is not exactly the same in each painting. The painter that pulled these together, did the paintings, had his or her own idea of what the different categories should be. But there are some that you're always going to see: mestizo, castizo, pardo, and so on and so forth, and then a few others that are kind of thrown in. So we have a lot of evidence for this. We just don't have a document. There was no charter that laid all of this out that we know of. It's never been found. And the casta system of identifying people according to these categories existed for a long time. It was really till the late 18th, going into the 19th century, that this was finally outlawed. And so it wasn't a functioning legal system anymore, But really pernicious part of this is that whole system of categorizing people still exists in the Americas. And so we still, as a culture, see things the way the Spanish did. And you can't really, if you're a person in this hemisphere, you can't really look at your own skin and not to some degree be looking through the lenses that the Spanish created. We can't totally disregard that. It needs to happen, you know.
Well, it's something I thought was interesting that I didn't realize it. It's not just about skin color or gradations of skin color or whatever. They had sort of intentional, the way they're dressed, the setting in the background, the tools that they're using, the like the way they're behaving or their demeanor, how they're portrayed, either as contemplative or tempestuous, or
Right.
there were all these other markers and cues that were sort of to signal what the status is of this person, but also to model to others, here's the, like you said, to encourage people to
Behave.
be more light,
Yeah.
go towards more light-skinned partners.
What the Spanish were doing.
Mhm.
Absolutely. And, if you look closely at these, and at one time or another, I've probably seen every Costa painting there is, just in the literature and the scholarship. And the people of color are really the bad guys. And, the associations with people of color in the Costa paintings are not good. They're degenerate, and there's this sort of implication that the Spanish are real human beings, and there's something wrong with people of color. Now, I mention this because at the same time that the Costa system was happening in the Americas, anthropological race theory was happening in Europe. And, names like Blumenbach and Linnaeus and Miner and so on. So on the one hand, what was happening in science in Europe during this time was very exciting. There was the new measuring of scientific approaches to animals in the animal kingdom, and how some animals could be described as um, um, related to other animals, and people were measuring skulls and bones and so on and so forth. And it was a heady time where anthropology was really being born as a science. And a lot of the early science wasn't very good science, but it was people trying to measure things and be scientific in their understanding of the animal kingdom and race. The really bad side of this was they were trying to do this by categorizing human beings into different, not just racial categories, but different orders of life in the animal kingdom. And the thinking was among a lot of these people was that there's the really human strain that goes back to Aryan early Germanic peoples. That is the prime stock of being human. They used the word beautiful a lot. They were smart. They were strong, and so on. And then there were other parallel strains that weren't as human as the Aryan strain. And some of these people, Linnaeus and Miners, that's their names, the Nazis later in the 20th century reached back and said, oh, these people really understood. And their idea of the Aryan race came from the theorizing that happened about race in this early anthropology in the 18th century. So there was a making explicit in their theory of race. There were human beings, they said, weren't quite in the human race. They were in their own separate animalistic race, and they would never be as good. And then there were degenerations of people that were part of the Aryan race, but they had they'd done too much blood mixing, the way the Spanish thought of it, with people of different races. So there was some really ugly racial theorizing going on. But so I don't think there was any influence from the casta system to this early anthropology in the 18th century, but they were mirroring each other just the same and coming up with some of the same conclusions. Now, thankfully, as anthropology progressed, they quickly dumped these theories and said, no, we're all people. We're all human beings. That was early theorizing. There was no evidence for it. But that idea of people of color not being like the rest of humanity and being a degraded version has held on. and the really ugly association of people of color with apes and chimpanzees, and saying black people are apes and so on and so forth. That's not just ugly racial stuff made up now. There's a tradition of that, a several hundred year tradition of some really ugly early anthropology. And I just mention this because they made explicit in their theorizing what was apparently in the air as the Spanish tried to recognize and understand these, various racial strains, and then depicting people of color, particularly women, very often. So if you were a woman with dark skin, you were very close to not being human. You were a degraded version. You didn't know how to behave. You didn't know how to respond to children. You couldn't be compassionate, reasonable, and so on. And maybe there were charters, theories about all of this that parallel what was happening in Europe. We don't know because none of that has survived. Or maybe it was there at one time and somebody destroyed it because the thinking was so ugly and so racist in the conclusions that it just became embarrassing later. We still know what the theorizing was in Europe because those were early scientists and their works are still there.
Well, now, I mean, that's clearly played out now that, black women are across the board the most oppressed
Absolutely.
demographic in our society. So
suffer violence 25 times, 25 times more likely to suffer violence than a white woman, and so on. Absolutely.
Yeah, so it was really interesting, you can see this almost is continuing in terms of like media portrayals of people of color where
Absolutely.
you see them with the behavior, like they're portrayed as criminals, and then that has been shown that has impacted people's idea of people of color. They assume they are not as emotionally regulated, or and then those consequences are all still occurring. This is all still being perpetuated. It's fascinating to see the roots of this.
Well, that's right, and ugly things like this don't just spring out of nowhere. There's always a history to it, and to understand that history is the first step in dismantling it and being able to reject it. What's a little discouraging, and I say this as somebody with Mexican American identification, is that in the late 17th and 18th century, the people who were picking up the trash and taking care of the children and tending the gardens and being in the fields and so on and so forth were brown people. And indigenous people had been indigenous and mixed with the Spanish. That's still the case. I mean, that's exactly what happens now. Look at the garbage men when they come by. Look at the people tending the yards and doing the childcare very often and so forth. And it can be very discouraging that in lots of ways, ugly as that the racism was in the 18th and 19th century, it's still here. I mean, it still mirrors what the way it started out.
Well, it's interesting because, there is a movement now towards decolonizing lives, decolonizing our mindsets. And that's popping around a lot. And I'll be honest that I didn't quite have a handle on how that applied to me or what that meant for me. But reading about these casta paintings, I realized that in my struggle to identify myself, having a white mother, having a Hispano father, I've been doing that to myself. And that is definitely the lens that other people have seen me throughout my life. Physically, I'm a little ethnically ambiguous. And so, I've never lived in New Mexico, so I'm out of place. And so in other places, people are always, I get all kinds of stuff. Japanese, are you Middle Eastern? People are sort of always trying to like categorize. And I think I'm sort of like doing that scanning as well to try to almost like look through the different categories to see where I fit and where I belong and what space I can claim.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that knowledge of the history that produced this, this racist regime that we're still living in the Americas, the bad side is that it happened, and that it's still happening. and it's still very much the environment that we're in. On the other hand, there is a good side, and the good side is that apologists for racism have very often said this has always been there. It's part of being human. The Greeks, anybody who wasn't a Greek during the classical Greek age was a barbarian. There's always been racism. We're not going to be able to make it go away. It turns out that's not right, really. Prior to the conquest in the Americas, racism was a national phenomenon. Somebody might hate Germans. Somebody might hate Austrians. Whatever. So there was racism, and maybe people were discriminated against. They were enslaved, etc. But it had to do with national identity. The uniqueness of racism based on ethnicity and skin color is really new in history. It really came with the Spanish. We know that now. That kind of racism was not widespread. And once the Spanish created this, through their convenient color coding, there were black people and red people and yellow people and so on and so forth. Once they set it in motion, there was a kind of back formation where it's influenced the earth, really. I mean, every place has been, the Spanish were very powerful colonizers, colonial powers, and their influence was amazing. And that really new form of racism based on skin color became the predominant. There's still national racism around the world, but predominantly, if you talk about racism, it has to do with skin color now. That's really new in history. And that opens up the possibility. It was created fairly recently. Anything that's done can be undone. That is in fact the case. This racism has not been around forever. It is not part of the human adventure. It really is not. It's fairly recent. That's encouraging in some ways. I'm kind of scraping the barrel trying to look for a good side, but that is the potential good side.
Well, for my kind of hopeful take on it is, this is all about human need for belonging to me. Like I look at all this stuff and I'm like, okay, everyone's trying to figure out, where do I belong? There's a very primal need to belong. But there's sort of two types of belonging. I'm a Brene Brown fan. So, she describes, there's fitting in, which I think is what has traditionally been a survival tactic. This is about power too. These
right.
casta paintings and everything, the system's about
Absolutely.
Power, status.
Right.
And so I think especially our ancestors had a very real need to associate with, this is the group that has the power and the status, and I'm going to try to be more like that. I'm going to try to align with that, or cover up these other, quote, inferior parts, and more align with this power. But real belonging comes from being able to be accepted for who you are in all the
investing
messiness,
in a community that you care about,
and what's aligned
right.
with who you are. And at the same time, I think there's a spiritual lesson for me in genealogy and in learning all these messy parts of our history and our ancestry, is that, we have all these different parts. We have all the parts. We are descended from the conquered, but also the conquistadors.
Mm-hmm. And
so you can't really ignore parts of it that you prefer over others. It's all there. All the warts and all, and the heroes, or it's all there. And we're all like that as well. Our own individuals, as communities, our families have all of those different parts as well. And we have to acknowledge and accept all of the parts, and even the negative ones, and acknowledge those and listen to those parts as well, to know where and how we need to heal. And so for me, it's about sort of learning about this and reconnecting with these parts, and understanding then, okay, where does healing need to occur? Whether on the individual level, in families, relationships, communities, or an entire culture.
I think that's exactly right. And, the fact is, once you know more about your past, it's humbling to know about your past. They weren't all kings and queens and, whatever. There were horse traders and, stealers and cattle rustlers and so on and so forth. And I think something that hasn't happened that needs to happen, though, is the really nasty tradition of seeing people of color as not human and they're animalistic, et cetera, that goes back to the 18th century early anthropological theory about race and to the casta system. That's like a gun. I mean, if there's too much of that thinking around, people who are insecure, lack self-esteem or whatever, it's too easy to pick up that gun of race and say, well, you dark-skinned person, I may look like I'm in a bad situation right now, but at least I'm better off than you. And there's that immediate, cheap, unreal satisfaction of picking up the gun of racism. The poetic justice here is that the anthropologists that started all of this in the 18th century now tell us through the Human Genome Diversity Project that there is no racial basis for community whatsoever. We now know that actual differences, genetic differences between people, are greater within communities than the differences that separate one community from another. So the belief in the past that there were superior racial strains has been totally blown up. We now know that what you said, power, politics, cultural vying for power, etc., is what makes people pick up that gun of racism and use it in some very terrible ways, as we saw in World War II and the original Holocaust that took place in the Americas. So I don't think that's really filtered into the culture yet, that there is no genetic basis for racism whatsoever. If you and I identify with each other as white people, whatever we want to call our community, there's a greater chance that we're divided by our genetics than there is that we're going to be divided from the Chinese community. That just doesn't bear out.
So, in terms of, I love that term cultural recovery because I feel like that's really what I've been doing with this podcast, with lots of other different areas. And I think there is a desire for that for a lot of people who might feel left out of the culture because, like, I don't speak Spanish. I didn't grow up in the culture. I didn't even know about any of this until I was well into adulthood and was very disconnected from it for reasons out of my control. But
Right.
And do I have a right? Do I have a place to claim any of that culture, any of that space? Is it? I'm going back and I was trying to learn like culture embroidery, which is like a folk art that's native to our culture. And the teacher said, actually we've had a huge surge in interest in this. And so clearly there are people who are wanting to sort of reach back and have that connection that I'm, part of this culture, even though for various reasons out of my control, was disconnected from it.
There are good things happening that inspire me all the time, and when I see people making real connections the way you're doing with the real history, your real history and your family's history, that's encouraging and that's real, and I think it's liberating. I do worry that there's so many layers of denial, there's so much purposeful amnesia in this hemisphere about the real history, how race is created, the terrible blot of the indigenous Holocaust with those 25 million people dying. People don't want that knowledge. It's there. They don't want it. And the denial of that awful past, it just doesn't fit with the smiling face of America, and that we've always been good people, the cherry tree and never telling a lie. No, we've told some whoppers, and they go very, very deep. And I think there have been people in the culture, artists and filmmakers, who have despaired a little bit. Can the truth at this point ever really be recovered? Is there enough cultural recovery, historical recovery possible? Or if we deny that history too many different times and there are too many layers of denial, it's not as though there isn't some awareness in the culture of a past very different from the one we've imagined for ourselves. But the question is, how close are we to a general recovery of that past, taking some credit for that past, owning it, being honest about it, etc. What the Spanish did has filtered through and shaped the world that we know in so many ways. and has not been impeded, and they haven't been called on it very much. And so much of what I write about in the book is not a secret. It's not that we didn't know it, but people won't talk about it. They don't want to talk about the racial categories where they came from. They still believe that black people are different from an indigenous people, and brown people are different from them in some way. But that notion from the 18th century still lurks in this ugly racism that you see showing its head now. And I worry that we've gone too far, and it may not be possible to recover that true history, and it's always going to haunt us and always come back and be like the ghost of the past that we just can't fully deal with. And I actually saw Mestizos Come Home as an attempt to undo that amnesia about the past. One book isn't going to change probably very much at all, honestly. I do worry about our inability to deal with our past. We've hidden from it so far, and I just hope that some of it's still recoverable by the sort of national identity being American. That it can still become part of that world. I hope that's possible.
Well, and I think young people are really making strides there, which is why then there are attempts to target education and cut off that history, because
right,
young people are gonna the ones to learn that and then carry that and do things differently. So they're trying to
absolutely
to cut that off.
No, that's exactly right, I think. And why can't we talk about our real history? Why is it subversive just to know history? But that's the way it's played out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. This was so great. I'm
so
glad we got a chance to do this.
Been a lot of fun for me too. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Luminaria. You can reach me at luminariapod@gmail.com. Our intro and outro music is of Varsoviana, performed by Nieves Anaya and his daughter Ernestina Anaya at Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico in 1940. It's part of the Juan Bautista Rael collection at the Library of Congress.